Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
Welcome to Parashat Tazria, where we hear lots about tzara'at, which is usually translated as leprosy, and it's pretty much all I have to say about that. Did I say anything else about Parashat Tazria, Rabbi Schatz?
Yes,
That's
but you're
much
also
what
not.
I've got.
You're also not starting at the right. This isn't the right place.
Yeah. You said 13, 3 through 4.
I know, but so you have to summarize the parsha before we get to our verses.
I don't have to do anything. You can't tell. You leave for 2 weeks and you just come back and you start telling me what to do. I mean, I opened up chapter 13 because chapter 12 is not particularly germane to what we will be exploring today. The first chapter of this parsha is talking about various methods for becoming tahor after contracting tum'ah. We talked about this a little bit with Jackie last week in terms of we usually translate tahor and temeh as pure and impure. It's of course more complicated than that. This translation is always interpretation, but basically starting off particularly after childbirth, what the woman, what's sort of required of the woman, depending on the sex of the child, and how long that period of time it needs to last. I don't have much more to say about it than that. Maybe Rabbi Schatz does.
I mean, I love this topic mostly because I think that Nida is really interesting. But I don't have so much more to say about like the particular parsha pieces. So you can take us straight to our verses if you want.
Matt, make sure you go back to talk about these verses. Great, here are these verses. Do you have anything to say? Nope. All right, well, good talk. Glad we just had those 90 seconds. Meanwhile, back in chapter 13, we're gonna start. I don't know why Rabbi Schatz picked these verses, but she knows why, so we'll get into them. Right, Rabbi Schatz?
Yep.
Okay. Didn't you miss doing this with me so much? How much did you miss doing this with me? Okay. Between so much and so much.
So much.
That's right. Okay.
I do have to say that yes. I have missed Parsha, like studying, right? Like for the past few weeks, I haven't had this as a centerpiece of my week. And so it's really interesting to come back right in time for Tazria and Matzorah, but to come back into Parsha and be able to learn it with all of you.
You and Rabbi Kligfeld weren't learning the Parsha in depth on the bus in Drome, America?
Well, we got to New Orleans for Shabbat. So he gave a drash on Saturday, on the Parsha, but no, we did not study Parsha. Okay, I'll take us through the verses since Rabbi Shapiro seems to be distracted. So we're going to look at verse 3. And the reason that I picked these verses is because I think that part of what's so interesting about Tameh and Tahor is how do you know when you are Tameh and how do you know when you are Tahor? And part of what we're going to see in these verses is that the priest was very involved in that decision. And as we all know, as professional, ritual, spiritual people, that doesn't mean that we're doctors.
That's actually what it says on my business card. Professional, ritual, spiritual. Rabbi Matt Shapiro, professional, ritual, spiritual person.
But we're not doctors, and yet...
And also not a doctor.
For the past few years, we have been, talking about a pandemic in a way that we want to be keeping our congregation and our community safe, but also using medical professionals because unlike what we're going to see in the Torah right here, we don't feel like we can be the ones to make those decisions given that we don't have any medical background or
Right, but that also gets to the question of, is tzara'at a medical condition, which the rabbis talk a lot about, right? Tzara'at is usually translated as leprosy, but looking, I mean, I don't want to blow the punchline of Sarah too much since we're talking about it both this week and next week. Thank you so much, leap year. You know, a dwelling can also contract Sarah, and generally houses don't get leprosy, right? So there seems to be some question as to, even though that is the closest analog to thinking about this, because it's talked about as a type of skin condition. And again, since I'm not a doctor, I don't know in depth what the different types of leprosy are. But it's also worth asking the question, well, what is this actually?
Okay, so let's get to the actual verses. Why don't you take us through them?
By the way, that was the preschool office calling me, and I was worried because I have a preschooler, and so I'm always worried. They were calling to see if Gesher could stop by my office to say Shabbat Shalom, which is so nice. They will come by after the class. And we can send them over to Rabbi Schatz, and maybe to Renee's, and she can be challah with them. What are we doing? Right, Parsha. Okay, chapter 13. The Lord spaketh unto Moshe and his bro, Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his flesh a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it is on, translating this is so weird, and it's on the skin of his body a mark, a nega, like a tzara'at-y
Blemish.
Wound. Oh, blemish. Very good. Thank you. Blemish. And he is brought to Aaron, who's the priest, or one of Aaron's sons, ... The priest sees the blemish on the skin of his flesh, and when the hair that's on the blemish turns white, and the priest sees that the blemish is deeper on the skin of his flesh, yea, verily, it's a blemish of tzara'at. And the priest sees it and declares him to be tameh, translated here as unclean. By the way, so these are the two, that's verse 3. We're diving into verses 3 and 4 of chapter 13. Verse 4, Ve'im baheret levanahi, if it is a particularly bright white spot, or sorrow, on the skin of his flesh, ve'amok ein mar'eha, min ha'or, and it doesn't seem to be deeper than the skin, use'ara lo hafach lavan, and the hair has not turned, the hair on the spot of the blemish has not turned white, ve'hizgir hakohen et hanega shiv'at yamim, the priest shall close. I read something interesting that sort of opened this translation up for question, but I'll read it as it's translated. The priest shall enclose him, shall quarantine him, one might say, in the parlance of our times, for 7 days. Shabbat Shalom.
Okay, great. Anything you want to say about it?
Anything you want to say?
Okay, great.
No, I mean, yeah, like Rabbi Schatz picked these verses. You can feel my excitement about them radiating through Zoom. And Gesher is here, so I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Schatz for Kushiyot.
Are you serious?
Yep,
Okay.
I am.
All
You
right.
got this. You're great.
Great. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So let's take some Kushiyot, and then I will in fact explain a little bit more about the verses. So any questions on these verses, whether about potentially why we picked them, or what they're actually about? Yeah, Denise.
So besides that it's just gross,
Yeah.
but I feel like I guess attached to the gross part is there's like a certain amount of shame that I feel like comes with it. And I feel like that even came, like you're talking about COVID and the pandemic, and there was like a lot of shaming going on of like, if somebody sneezed, or even if somebody got COVID, it was like, you don't tell people and all this kind of stuff. And that doesn't seem like such a great thing. Like, couldn't we accomplish these goals without shame?
Great question. So I think you're right that it doesn't come off the page with language and with shame, but you're right that there's this feeling, there's this connotation for sure of shame. And I actually think this is part of why I brought these verses. I actually think that a lot of that very cute. I actually think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you have to go to the priest, right? That you can't just go to I don't know, your parent and say, I have a cold. Can I stay home from school today? You have to go to a doctor. And if we're going to connect it to COVID, I at least felt a shift in terms of people's shame around testing positive when they could take a test at their house versus having to go somewhere, get tested, send in results. So I don't know that that's true. I haven't read any studies on that, but I do wonder if it's in your hands, right? Having the power to not necessarily decide, but kind of share that information versus going somewhere, getting tested because you have symptoms and then being told that you are positive, that in a certain way feels a little bit more, I guess shameful, but also powerful.
Like how it's phrased, right? He shall look upon him and pronounce him. And there's no give him a hug, right. Hold his hand, I had a doctor's thing once and I had a spider bite, but she thought it was inflammatory cancer. And this woman in the urgent care, and she just looked at me. She didn't even hold my hand, right? She looked at me. She drew a big purple circle on my body. And she said, you have a mass, like that. And I was like, oh my God, I just felt so, I cried for days. I didn't even want to read the after summary that they give you at Kaiser, and it turned out she was an idiot, and thank God. But it just felt so horrible, yeah. and I feel like maybe I'm just bringing my own story to this, but it feels like the Kohen does the same thing. There's no,
yes, hey,
sit down, let's talk about this,
Yeah, totally. And I think that there's also not, sterile is not the word that I'm looking for, but very, it's very diagnostic, right? This is what you have.
Clinical.
As what?
Clinical.
Thank you. I think I was trying to think of that word the other day and you helped me think of it. So maybe clinical is just a word I can't think of.
I'm just a clinical guy.
Yeah. But you're right that there is something, Rabbi Shapiro just put in the chat, F- for bedside manner, right? That it's true, right? When you need to be able to help a person feel as though you are really supporting them and helping them through something, not just telling them what's going on in their life in terms of their health. Yeah, Renee. You're muted.
Who decides how white the skin is or how deep the appearance of the hair is? If he has one strand of white and one white dot, does that make him unclean?
Great question. You mean, depending on size versus there at all? Is that what you mean? You muted yourself, so I can't hear you.
Size or quantity of the whiteness, both in the skin and in the hair? Who makes the determination how much it is actually considered tahara?
Right. It seems as though that any kind of sarat is determined by the priest, which again, to me feels pretty silly because a priest is not a doctor. So that seems to be the case. I am sure this is not the direction that I was looking at in terms of commentary, so I didn't see any on this. But I'm sure that there are many commentaries on what, who was deciding and how big and how deep into the skin and how white, et cetera, et cetera. I was focusing more on the priest part, so I didn't see those commentaries. But yeah, it seems as though, again, the priest is the one who's making those decisions. Okay. Any other? Yeah, Paula.
So it seems to me that in many cultures, you have healers who are priests. You have shaman. You have, and so it doesn't seem that unusual to me that the priest is the person who's looking at your skin or the discoloration or the growth or something like that. And so it seems consistent with, just a whole tradition of healing that has that's valid as well.
And they didn't have medical school in the ancient Near East, from what I know. Right? Like there might have been people who were specifically trained in stuff, but I think things are more professionalized and specialized now than they used to be, I think, right? Like we have a disintegrated sense of what health is, like I don't think we can necessarily so easily separate out physical health from emotional health from spiritual health, right? Those things are connected. There's a reason that there's a robust and wonderful spiritual care department at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, including a particularly skilled, lovely young rabbi who works there. Because spiritual health is connected, right? It's not to say that you can pray a disease away, and we got to take care of our whole selves. I think it's not necessarily a polarity.
Right.
Yeah, there are definitely healers, and we even see this in today's world of people not just wanting a doctor, but wanting a doula, right? Or wanting a chaplain, or wanting a rabbi, right? To come and be part of the healing process. So it definitely doesn't come out of left field. I think the thing that's so interesting to me about this particular case in the Torah, though, is that a priest is the one deciding whether or not you are part of the community or not, right? And to me, when I think of the priest's role in that time, but also if we're going to equate it to a rabbi's role in today's time, even as Denise was saying, even as people felt separate and still do feel separate from a community during COVID, I feel very strongly that it's our job to make sure that even if they're distant, that they feel connected. And so it was a very stark comparison to me that a priest was the one who was saying, no, stay away, and not necessarily doing anything to make them feel close. I also have now lived in these two parshiot for 10 days because I prepared for this class. I'm teaching Seudah Shlishit tomorrow. We have Hamalot tomorrow morning, and I wrote the Table of Five for Jewish Journal, which you have to submit 2 weeks in advance. So I've been talking about Tameh and Tahor.
I thought you said you were missing being a part of the Parsha, and now 10 minutes later you tell me you only focus on this Parsha.
And what I wrote about for Table of Five actually has to do with the priest, the priest kind of being very, very, unavailable, and the leper being the one who has to kind of get themselves to the priest. So it's an interesting way of thinking about communal leadership and spiritual leadership. So I agree with you, Paula, and just wish he was doing a little bit of a better job of being a healer and not just a diagnostician.
And my other question, which I hope you'll talk about, is and I know we've talked about it many times, and it's still interesting to me, I guess, because I'm trying to wrap my head around it, about pure and impure, clean and unclean.
Yeah, totally.
And I think Jackie had another, description or definition of it last time, and I can't remember it, but it was that's an interesting way to look at it as well.
So tomorrow afternoon at Seudah Shlishit, my whole class is about Tameh and Tahor, and and the different ways that we can define Tameh and Tahor. But
she's fit and not yet fit. It was something like that.
That's how Rabbi Eddie Feinstein defines it, that we walk around in the world as Tameh all the time. And the reason that that's good, actually, and okay, is because that means that we are interacting with mitzvot that make us tameh, right? We are reproducing. We are dealing with dead bodies. We are dealing with creepy, crawly things, right? Anything that makes you
Don't talk about my kids that way.
Anything that makes you tameh means that you're living in the world. And so if you are tahor, this is the way that Rabbi Feinstein, and there's a little bit of a spoiler for tomorrow, but the way that Rabbi Feinstein defines it, and by the way, just a side note, Rabbi Klickfeld, I think, or maybe Rabbi Lucas, I don't remember, someone asked me for my first drash at Temple Beth Am when I was an intern to give my first formal drash, not teaching, but my first formal drash.
Was it your first formal drash?
On Tazria Mitzorah. And so I spoke on this Parasha because they didn't want to. And I was talking to Rabbi Feinstein about it because at the time he was my teacher. And one of the beautiful things that he said was that the reason that back in the day when there was the temple, we needed to give sacrifices when we were tahor was because we actually needed that spiritual closeness. Whereas if we think of tameh as being out in the world with people doing mitzvot, that is in and of itself a spiritual closeness, but it doesn't avail you of the opportunity to go towards a temple. So in today's day, when we don't have the temple, it's actually perfectly wonderful and maybe even better to be tameh because that means that you're out in the world interacting with humans. Whereas if you are tahor, that means that you're sitting home not doing anything, and anytime you are exposed to something, you go to the mikvah, which takes up time. So it's it's definitely not how we talk about tameh and tahor in terms of nida, but it is a very interesting way of thinking about the categories of tameh and tahor and taking them away from like the icky factor of tameh being unclean, which it just definitely is not, and tahor as being clean. But rather spiritually available and already spiritually like participating and involved. But more on that tomorrow afternoon. Okay, so Rabbi Shapiro, I know I'm in charge, but I just spoke a lot. Do you want to share anything on these verses before I do, or do you want me to just share all the things on the verses?
I'll share. Sure. Okay. I remember
that so well, Paula. It's funny that you said that. I remember that.
What? Huh? What?
Paula just chatted me privately, that one of my really close friends, who she's also family friends with, had his bar mitzvah parsha on Tazria Mitzorah, and I remember that really very clearly because his mother is a very funny person, and I remember him getting up, or her getting up, and giving him his blessing at his bar mitzvah and saying something along the lines of, "Sorry that we gave you this bar mitzvah parsha where you had to talk about penises." And that was her. No one else would have done that to their 13-year-old son, but that was her.
I mean, of the things to apologize for talking about in this parsha, I wouldn't focus on that part. Chapter 12 for a 13-year-old boy to have to focus on like discharges that women may have after childbirth, I think would be the thing that I would. Yeah, but
when you're 13 years old, I think the other thing is a little bit more embarrassing. Okay, anyway, continue.
You've never been a 13-year-old boy. You don't know that.
I lived with 3 of them, so I know them pretty well. Okay, continue.
There were 3 13-year-old boys?
Yes.
Currently?
No, I lived.
Oh, it was a past tense.
Okay, can you continue?
You missed me so much.
Go.
One grammar-y thing that I thought was interesting, one symbolism thing that I thought was interesting, and one recapitulation of the high priest thing that seemed interesting. None of them are long, but I found them to be interesting. And then Rabbi Schatz will really teach and or tell me why I'm wrong. Probably both. I want to go to verse 4. I mentioned this as I was translating them, and this was just something that caught my eye in terms of a grammar thing that was interesting, because particularly now we're kind of wired we're particularly wired to see things as quarantined. And it's how it's translated here. Like the last phrase of verse 4 says, V'hiskira kohen et hanega shivat yamim, which is usually translated as, and the priest will quarantine this person for 7 days. But if you actually look at the pshat, and that's how it, like if you Sepharia it, or you just look in the commentary, right? Like, this is how Rashi understands it, and Rashi is often like the normative baseline for how commentators in turn think about it, right? Everybody's in conversation with Rashi, right? Whether they agree with him or disagree with him, most commentators are usually in conversation with Rashi, and this is how Rashi understands it, right? That the priest, while enclosed, shall shut him up, shall quarantine him in one house, and shall not see him. That's how Rashi understands it, and most commentators fall in line with Rashi on it. But it's not actually what the pshat of the verse says, right? What it says is the priest should enclose the blemish, right? Hanega. It doesn't say that the priest should enclose like the person who is being impacted, like which would be the menuga. It says hanega, shivat yamin. Basically sort of similar to, hopefully less traumatic, but similar to what Denise has described. Like if you think about if you have like an infection, right? They like draw a circle around it, right? To kind of track it, see if it's shrinking or staying the same size. So I don't have like much of a like drash on that, other than to just sort of note the comment that it's interesting how sometimes even like the grammatical pshat of the verse, once it gets interpreted one way, that becomes the normative way of understanding it. And I just think it's interesting that, and by the way, it also seems like less extreme, right? It's that if this is a skin condition, particularly, right, because verse 4 seems to be less extreme than verse 3, right? Because verse 4 is saying, yeah, if there's some discoloration, but it's not deeper than the skin and the hair hasn't turned white, really still you have to quarantine for a full week? No, right? If we read the actual pshat of the verse the way it's written, it just says, yeah, keep an eye on it, right? Like make sure it doesn't get worse. But going back into the pshat of the verse actually seems to like kind of lessen that a bit. So I thought that was an interesting point.
I never paid attention to that, probably because it's grammar and I'm not great at it. But that's really awesome.
And by the way, it's from it's from Iturei Torah, which Adam Kligfeld's favorite compilation of comments that he's always stealing from my office. He still owes me a Gimel, I think, but I haven't been able to find it. But usually, like 99+% of the time, the author of this compilation just sort of brings other people's comments. This is his comment, right? Like he doesn't attribute it to anyone else. It's actually his comment. He sources it. He says it's from the Rosh, but it's his comment, which I just thought is interesting. So, even the accumulated weight of our tradition sometimes needs to be sort of course corrected a little bit. So I think that's interesting. Okay. Yes. Paula.
So, that brings to mind for me is that we're not always our worst act. Like we can make a mistake and we can repair it, or we can try and repair it, or we can act differently. But so here we have this, blemish, and we're isolated or quarantined from the community. And it doesn't have to. I just think of like sometimes your only experience with people is in their worst moment, and then you think that's who they are, that's how they are, they never change, and then you realize, well, maybe that's not true, right? And that we're not always our worst act, or we're not always the most harm we've done.
Yeah. I'm actually
going to right up for me.
Yeah, and I'm gonna use that as a jumping off point to one of the other things I was gonna bring. If that's okay. Renee has Renee, I'm going to say the thing I was going to say, and then you can say your thing. Paula gave me a great segue. I'm very focused on the specific meaning of the verses today. As everyone knows, I am deeply thorough in my understanding of biblical Hebrew. That's what everyone always says about me. Right, Rabbi Schatz?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's not paying attention. Okay.
I am paying attention. I'm just trying not to feed your fire.
You're not paying attention. Yeah. So getting back into the specifics of the Hebrew, if you look back in verse 3, there's a doubling of a verb, right? And we know this from our conversations that everything's in the Torah for a reason, of course, every phrase, every word, every letter, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at verse 3, the Kohen sees twice, right? So the Kohen sees at the beginning of the verse, V'ra'ah HaKohen et hanega, right? Like the Kohen sees the blemish. And then at the end, V'ra'ahu HaKohen v'timeh oto, that the Kohen sees a second time, right? So our rabbinically trained minds then automatically think, okay, why does he need to see twice, right? What's the second seeing? And there's a few different comments on this, and I'll sort of like steer this a little bit in the direction of Sara'at isn't just a skin affliction, right? Sara'at seems to be indicating something deeper than just leprosy. And I don't know if Rabbi Schatz is going to bring any of that stuff, but are you going to talk about the different things about what leprosy can mean?
You mean like Lashon Hara and stuff?
Yes. No.
I just feel like people know it, so I didn't focus on it.
You don't know that. You know that people know that. Don't make assumptions.
Okay.
Oftentimes, leprosy is understood as being a reflection of one's psycho-spiritual condition as well, and is often attributed, the disorder itself is often attributed to speaking Lashon Hara, to not speaking kindly about others. And so the Meshech Chochmah talks about how the second seeing here isn't about what's on the surface necessarily, but it's about something deeper. That the Kohen's seeing of this person, or there's something about the priest that he's able to look at this person and not just see what's on his skin, but what's happening more deeply with him, like his matzah, his condition, like how he is. And if it's both, right? It's not just about what's on his skin, but if there's something on his skin and the Kohen does sort of this deeper looking at who this person is, and there's something off with both of those, then that's the point at which the Kohen declares him to be impure, right? Still an F- on bedside manner. Right? Let's be clear about that. And interesting to think about how the second seeing opens up the conversation a little more deeply of what's really going on with this person. I'm going to layer one more piece on top of that. It's the last thing I'll sort of offer, and then Renee is going to say what she's going to say, and then Rabbi Schatz is going to Schatz it up. Which is, there was an interesting question that I saw was raised asking why white? Because white, if you're thinking about in the context of pure or impure, white is usually
pure,
right? Like we dress in white on Yom Kippur, right? Aspirational, we're going to be pure like the angels. So why would it be that if there is something problematic happening, that it would turn white? Right, that the patch would turn white, that the hair would turn white, etc. And it was just an interesting comment riffing on a quote from the Gemara that people might have heard, Hamalbim pnei chavero ki'ilu shofech damim, that someone who embarrasses his friend so that his face turns white, it is as if he has spilled blood, which is held up as one of the primary sources for why speaking Lashon Hara, for why speaking badly about others is considered to be such a heinous act. And then the connection made is onsho midah keneged midah, right? That basically the punishment essentially should fit the crime. So if you are someone who causes someone's face to become white, then what will happen is you will turn white yourself, right? And then it's kind of this indicator of what's really going on there, and therefore what must be done to kind of remedy that situation. So I had never seen those pieces kind of lined up in that way before, and I thought that in terms of thinking about Sara'at as an indicator of Lashon Hara, and also thinking about this idea of wellness as something that's integrated, right? Not just what's happening on your body, but sort of your deeper condition, and how that lines up with what you have or haven't done. I just thought those were some interesting pieces.
I like the connection to loss of blood from your face, which, by the way, I think is such a funny thing, because I think at least when I get embarrassed, I turn red, not white.
Yeah, you do.
But I think it's just an interesting, it's an interesting connection to the color piece.
Yeah, for sure. Renee, I don't know if we've bulldozed past whatever you were going to say, but I still want to give you the floor.
Well, I was concerned that that they didn't mention anything about the emotional piece of the person who they talk about what he looked like, but what about what he's feeling? And I was thinking when you were talking about the color that that sometimes people, when they feel afraid, fearful, or they feel like they're going to pass out, they turn white.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I think to go back to, I think it was Denise, to go back to, the idea, we don't really know the emotional repercussions of what's happening in this at all. We just hear about kind of, again, the clinical parts of diagnosing a person and telling them they have to stay away, but we don't actually hear about the feelings or the emotional drain on the person based on what the priest says. If we're going to take this to the mental and spiritual health piece of our program, this is still happening specifically for our teens during COVID, right? And also for adults, but we're hearing about it a lot with our teens, in terms of mental health and being cooped up, and also the reverse of going back into social settings and not knowing how to deal with that and having anxiety around that. And just unfortunately, suicide rates going up and isolation being something that kids are feeling more comfortable with than being in social settings, which is not what we want for children. So, it's happening all over the place, and we don't hear about that in the Torah, but I can only imagine that someone being told they have to be in isolation, especially by a higher up authority, might feel really bad, right? Might not. But it's feel
also, the priest is also a very subjective opinion. It's just a priest. What if another priest might not think that they needed to do that?
I mean, I think I think it's definitely in the pshat level, like in the context of the verse, problematic, and I think that's why there are some sources that come in from the rabbis talking about what's the actual role of the priest here. I mean, I think that's part of what Rabbi Schatz was asking about at the beginning of the class. And I think that, all responses are coming out of an explicit or implied question, right? And I think one of the certainly at least implied question is, well, what qualifies the priest to be able to do this? And I think reframing this not just as a physical condition, but as a sort of deeper condition, and that therefore assumed and kind of baked into this response is that because of the high priest's stature, that man, there were only men back in the day, that man has the ability to look deeply and get a sense of what's going on with this person. That is kind of the qualification. Now we can have a conversation about whether or not that actually happened, right, and what would make that person qualified to be able to diagnose it. But within at least a lot of the sources that I were seeing, that's what the rabbis are indicating. Rabbi Schatz, I don't know if you saw it differently or corroborate that, but that's a lot of what I was seeing.
Yeah, Denise.
When Rabbi Shapiro talked about men, it just made me think about issues of modesty and concealing and all these kinds of things. And I just wonder, is there anything that talks about, because if you think about the way people dressed in those days and the way people interact and stuff, most of a person is covered, who's really going to know if you have a little white thing somewhere, so, was there enforcement of these things, or is there anything written about, if you have a white dot and you don't tell anyone, do you get kared or something, or how does that all work? Because I also if it's something you could easily hide, and maybe, your husband or wife is okay with it and going to keep your secret, and otherwise you have to go into isolation indefinitely, how many people are really going to do that?
Yeah, I don't know, maybe Rabbi Shapiro knows, but I don't know of anything that talks about kind of whose responsibility it was to come forward. My guess is that people felt as though, similar to COVID actually, that they felt as though if this was something they were dealing with, that it was only safe, for them to take care of it as opposed to walking around with it because it was supposed to be highly infectious. So my guess is that if someone saw it on their own body,
the white dot thing is infectious?
It's supposed to have taken over. I mean, the Torah even talks about how it affected your whole home and your clothes, and right, it's supposed to have really spread very quickly. So
it doesn't make sense then if it's also like saying that people got this from Lashon Hara, then like, how do you know you didn't just get it because someone was walking around infectious? Like,
Right, totally. I mean, the Lashon Hara piece is midrash, right, and is trying to make meaning of why people would have actually.
I don't know. I think Lashon Hara can be pretty contagious.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, like, I think
like the story with the feathers,
yeah,
feather story.
Right. No, I'm just saying, I think it's, it wasn't like you spoke Lashon Hara and then a white blemish showed up. In terms of actual medical, Rabbi Shapiro thinks that that's what happened. I don't think that's what happened.
There are commentaries that talk about that.
I understand. I'm just saying that.
Rabbi Schatz hates what I brought.
No, you're literally putting words into my mouth. No, but I think
Rabbi Schatz loves what I brought.
I think that what you are getting at, Denise, that is so important to think about is who has the responsibility. And how do you take that responsibility seriously, right? The person clearly had to go to the priest themselves and say, this is something I found on my body, because as you're pointing out, unless it was on your face, it probably wasn't something that other people were noticing. And so you were taking that responsibility to keep other people safe, but also kind of outing yourself in such a way that other people might not have known, except for they could have caught it from you potentially. So yes, I think it's all very easily connected to the world that we've lived in recently, but also probably metaphorical for ways in which we deal with our own responsibilities of how we interact in the world with our bodies and the health of our bodies, etc. Okay, it's 11:52, so I want to share one text of the many that I prepared. But this has been a really great conversation, so I'm glad that we had it. So this, I had never heard this particular text connected to the sugya from the Gemara that I'm going to show you right now. But I think it's very interestingly, connected. So the Orach Chaim is writing this as a commentary, but brings in a part from Masechet Shabbat on page 119. That is a story that you've probably heard before, but I've never heard it connected to this part of Torah. So I'm just going to read in the English for time's sake. So when the priest takes a look at the person who has this blemish, he declares him ritually impure. Okay. The Torah made the impurity conditional on the priest declaring him so. This reminds us of a statement in Shabbat 119 from the Gemara that two angels accompany a person on their way home from the synagogue on Friday night, and they examine if this person had made the preparations for Shabbat prior to going to the synagogue. If they made the preparations, one angel commends the person. The good angel exclaims, "May you continue to do so." And the second angel, who represents the negative, the Yetzer Hara, the negative actions of you, in cartoons, the devil on that shoulder.
One's earthly inclinations as opposed to one's highest self.
Says Amen. The reverse happens when the person in question had not made preparations for Shabbat before the onset of Shabbat. At any rate, the Talmud suggests that once a positive or negative momentum has been built, it feeds upon itself unless something contrary happens. Seeing that it is the
mitzvah goreret mitzvah.
Hold on.
Avera goreret avera.
Seeing that it is the priest's duty to obtain atonement for Israel from their impurities, diseases, etc., God has commanded the person to concur with the judgment of impurity the afflicted person has been subjected to. This state of impurity will continue until the afflicted person turns into a penitent, when God will remove the symptoms of impurity from them. I just thought this was a very interesting way of talking about kind of that responsibility. I don't love that it's being connected to if someone is halachically prepared for Shabbat or not, because I think that should be a personal thing, not a public thing. But I love the idea of these angels that are accompanying you, being representative of our closeness to God in terms of how we are aware of that which we are also dealing with, as Rabbi Shapiro said, kind of in our earthly state, in terms of this tzara'at. Does anybody have any comments on this?
I'm trying. Hold on. What's happening here?
Well, okay. While you try to figure out, Paula was shaking her head. So do you have something to say about it, Paula? No. Okay. Yes, Rabbi Shapiro, what is your kushia?
I don't know what's happening. What's going on? So Shabbos is coming. The person does the thing.
Shabbos has already come.
Good vibes or no good vibes, that impacts how your Shabbos is going to go. Great. And then what's the tzara'at connection here? So the priest then, God has commanded him to concur with the judgment of impurity, meaning that's God's judgment of impurity because the person is tzara'at. So the priest needs to agree with it? Is that what's being indicated?
Needs to agree with what?
God has commanded him to concur with the judgment of impurity the afflicted person has been subjected to. What judgment?
I think of having tzara'at.
That having tzara'at is the judgment.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
I think so.
But then what does it mean for the person to turn into a penitent? What's that process?
I think that's the process of going to the priest and finding a way to then become tahor. At least that's how I read it. Meaning you then find that connection, that closeness. You then rid yourself of whatever it was that made you tameh with tzara'at in the first place, therefore becoming tahor and therefore closer to God. Which again is not the way that I translate tameh and tahor, but that's how this is.
Right. This is Orach Chaim on this verse?
This is. Yeah.
So he doesn't become just because it's Shabbat, he doesn't become pure again.
No. So the Shabbat piece is just a story trying to get us to understand the way in which the connection to, they're using angels here, but the connection to a higher power, to some kind of divine being in like a very personalized, judgmental way, right? That those angels walk home with you from Shabbat because they're supposed to check on your Shabbat preparations. Again, I don't love the fact that the angels are accompanying you because they want to make sure that you are following the letter of the law in terms of being Shomer Shabbat. I do like the idea of angels following you home so that you have this connection with the divine in terms of you entering into Shabbat. And so what I think the move that's being made here is when we approach the priest, right, in order to say, I am tameh, can you help me become tahor? That is your kind of, your claim that you need that connection in order to become, spiritually connected or prepared, in terms of your relationship with God. Bonnie.
I was taken with the idea of the positive or negative momentum. Because that really is true, that if you're doing positive things, you're more likely to continue doing that.
Sure.
And the same with the negative that we do feed upon. If we're in a bad mood, it takes some kind of something to, get us out of that.
Sure.
And that maybe that's how that's connected with I don't know how it's connected with the impurities.
Yeah. I mean, you could, if you have tzara'at and you don't go to the priest, you could stay in that impure state for a long time because you haven't gone towards the priest to figure out how you're gonna remove yourself from that state. Again, this commentary, because the rabbis like to use the language of impure versus pure, we're seeing here the negative versus positive connotation of those things. But really, if we're going to talk about a certain kind of readiness versus a state of kind of perpetual connection, that you you see that, as you're saying, like that momentum to, if you don't have a connection, you're probably going to stay not connected unless you're brought in, versus if you feel like you already have that connection, you probably are going to do things to maintain it. So that, I think that's what the Or HaChaim is saying here, maybe in a nicer way than he's saying it, but that's what I got out of it, the positive that I got out of it. All right. I'm going to conclude this, unless Rabbi Shapiro is very excited to, by saying,
do the bow.
Do the bow. I can stop sharing my screen. I really hope that even though these parshiot are not particularly exciting nor pleasant to read through, I do think that there is something very powerful about thinking that our Torah has taken the time to focus on the ways in which we affect those around us, whether that's through our bodies or through our speech or through the ways in which we interact with our leadership, right? That our actions and our, like holding ourselves in the world makes a difference. And what are we doing to make that a positive difference, as opposed to one that could be either hurtful or less positive, I won't say negative, in the world, and how are we connecting to those who can help us continue that positivity?
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.